recording, and it will be available for download later. So let's get started. I am very pleased to introduce to you all Dr. Sherry Adrian. She is a professor at Southwestern University in Georgetown, Texas. And I had the good fortune of meeting Dr. Adrian earlier this summer at a Texas Project Wild Facilitators Forum, where I attended a presentation by the same title, Diversity is Nature's Greatest Asset, including all students in Project Wild. And I was really excited about this content and how we can reach a broader audience with Project Wild. And so I invited Dr. Adrian to present, and fortunately, Sherry, you accepted that invitation, so thank you.
Sure, I'm excited.
Well, I'm going to be, Sherry's going to be doing most of the talking, and I'm going to be trying to steer this boat. I still have my learner's permit with this webinar software, but so far so good. So bear with me. I'm going to get started here and advance it to the next slide. Okay, so as I said, the webinar is being recorded, and Sherry, I'll let you take it from here, and I'll mention, by the way, this is a photo of Sherry, if you're wondering. Go ahead, Sherry.
Hello, everybody. I really appreciate Mark asking me to present, and really it's going to be what I hope is, though in unusual fashion, a conversation. And so I really am excited about being here. I thought I'd give you just a little bit of my background. I've been at Southwestern for, I think this is starting my 26th year, and I'm a certified teacher both in general education and first grade through 8, and then special ed K through 12, and then English as a second language K through 12. And I've basically been doing educator preparation for about, like I said, the 26 years. And I go in and out of public classrooms. I taught in public classrooms, and I also taught in psychiatric treatment facilities. So that's my background. Mark sent you a lot of materials, and I'm hoping everybody had a chance to kind of look at those materials, because we're going to go through each one of those things. And I want to give you kind of a thought before we get started with these essential questions, and that a thought about experiential learning and kind of outdoor school learning and so forth. And one of the things that when I was asked to make the original presentation that I know is that to some degree, this kind of learning can have a tendency to privilege certain students and to exclude other students. And it's pretty easy. There are lots of things that we can do to counterbalance that. And I just want to, that's kind of my motivation to do this. I want to be sure that this type of learning is available to a lot more of our students. Mark, you were going to ask folks about their backgrounds.
Yes.
And I would be curious to hear that.
Okay, so I'm going to try to launch this poll. All right. Well, we have a little difficulty with poll again, so I'm going to do it with text, the chat box. So the first question is, I'd like you to tell us your role with Project Wild, and your choices are: you're a Project Wild coordinator, you're a facilitator, or the third choice would be other, and then you can give a brief description. So if you could, in your chat, let us know, are you a state coordinator or a regional coordinator? Are you a facilitator or other?
Okay, great. Can we go back to the previous slide and look at the essential questions?
Sure. Okay, can you see them now?
Yeah. So I really have two big ideas that I want us to think about. And I want us to be able to look at 3 selected lessons, and we're just going to use those as kind of examples. But I want us to be able to look at the way in which the current lessons are designed. And then the second thing is I want us to look at how we might change that design a little bit so that more students can benefit from Project Wild. And of course, my question is the idea that if everybody is learning about the Earth, Project Wild stated that they wanted all people and to learn about all people and wildlife. And so I would want to be sure that our students who have differences are included in that process. So let's go to the next one.
Okay, and Sherry, before we go on, I just want to share some of our results and also maybe ask a second question, if I may, to the audience. And so we have a pretty good mix of state coordinators, facilitators, folks from around the country. As far as I can tell thus far, all in the United States, but I don't really have that information, but that's probably the case. We have Jerry Miller, who's with the Salvation Army, who works in different parts of the country. And then we have a few others that are in the other category, but probably everybody is very well acquainted with Project Wild. The second question I wanted to ask, and this will be the last survey question, and that is, if you could rank on a 5-point scale, with 1 being high, expert level, and 5 being low, which would be none. The question is, how would you rate your knowledge of educational methods pertaining to inclusion, inclusion of diverse learning needs, diverse learning styles, and special learning needs? So that big, broad definition of inclusion and diversity. How would you rate your knowledge? 1 being expert level and 5 being no knowledge, and maybe 3 being somewhere, some knowledge.
That's a great question, and I'll be curious to see what everybody has to say. Let's go to the next slide.
Sure, okay, and then I'll check back with you a bit.
That'd be great.
Okay.
So I've set 3 goals for us. I want us to explore 3 different approaches, and we're going to be looking at universal design for learning. We're going to be looking at Ann Tomlinson's differentiated instruction framework. We're going to talk about culturally responsive teaching, and we're going to look at specific Project Wild sample lessons and try to apply those 3 approaches, one approach to one lesson. And then I'm interested in hearing your recommendations for other kinds of changes or accommodations, or your own strategies that you use that you think are effective in addressing some of the diversity needs of your students or of your facilitator students. So let's go to the next one. You were going to tell them about new content.
Yes, okay, so it's possible that some of you may be using the activities from the previous edition of Project Wild Terrestrial. Don't worry, that's fine. When we get into talking about these activities and the content, you may hear references to activities that contain new content. And so when you see this icon of the 2 guides with the red arrow at the top of your screen, that's when I'll give you a brief update about what that new content is, and hopefully that'll avoid any confusion if there's some discussion about any procedures, for example, that you're not familiar with. You'll know that it's a result of the updated version of the Project Wild Guide.
That also connects to something that I found, because when I was first asked to do the original presentation this summer, I was using the prior edition and had made notes and was, thinking about my presentation. And then I got the new book, and I was really delighted, Mark, to be able to see some changes that had already been made in various lessons of things that I had thought of that maybe needed to be made, and they were already there. So that was exciting to me to get the new version.
Good.
Yeah.
All right.
So when we think about Project Wild and we think about best practice for all students, there is a wide repertoire of what people are considering best practice today. And you're going to be very familiar with these because the nice thing about it is that Project Wild includes every one of these approaches or pedagogies. So let's just kind of review them in general. And again, these are things that you're going to be very familiar with. So one of the most important things today is to try and get students engaged in setting kind of their learning goals. And so developing effective and essential questions, starting out a lesson to where the focus is identified for students. And that helps them in making those connections as you go through the lesson and identifying the big ideas. As I said, it's really helpful if students can also participate in making those essential questions and formulating their own ideas about what they want to ask. And that helps them connect different ideas in the lesson. And then if you look, of course, at each one of the lessons provided, they have objectives which can easily be turned into essential questions. And then also in some areas, those essential questions are posed in the Project Wild lessons. So that's a really good thing. Of course, experiential learning, well, that's what Project Wild is all about. It's about exploration and discovery, and it's also about application and analysis, problem solving, especially when you look at some of the extension activities in some of the lessons. Those more analysis and problem solving ideas are really pursued in the extension. One other idea for experiential learning is that it's centered in the students' lives. And the way that Project Wild is effective in doing that is when we are able to take students out into their school campus community or their town or city community, and that they are able to explore the outdoors in connection with where they live. And for a lot of kids, that's going to be new. And so it really helps them appreciate where they live and the breadth of experiences that they can have in their own community. And so that's important. Also, we talk about cooperative learning as being an essential pedagogy. It helps with kids thinking about how they're thinking and how they're communicating with other people. It helps with group problem solving and social skills. And a lot of the Project Wild is about working together with their peers. And so that is really helpful. The next one is that critical thinking through reflection. That's, again, one of the strengths of Project Wild. We want students not to just sit back and learn, but we want them to be able to tell us what they've learned, to engage in kind of that self-assessment. And so a lot of the lessons within Project Wild do have students expressing their ideas in a variety of ways, written, oral, visual. We have them asking questions, doing critical analysis, thinking about what they're learning and what it means to them, and engaging in kind of that self-regulation of their goal setting to their learning. And that is found throughout Project Wild. So that's good news. The next one, the last one is direct instruction. And with anything, even when you're going out and you're going to do discovery learning or you're going to do exploration, there often is information that students are just going to need. They may not have the foundational concepts, they may not have the vocabulary, and so you're going to need to provide some of that direct instruction before you go out into the field or before you do the activity within the school or classroom or wherever it's happening, and that vocabulary development. And again, that's a strength of Project Wild because Project Wild identifies those foundational concepts. They do have exercises where they emphasize vocabulary. In fact, one of the lessons we're going to look at talks about specific vocabulary around tracks that animals make. And then also you need to provide direct instruction for the skills and procedures when they go out to do these activities. So a lot of the lessons in Project Wild talk about how to be careful about interacting with nature, about being respectful of the habitat and so forth. And those are skills that students need to be taught directly, especially for students who don't have as much opportunity to go out into the field and do that kind of work. They're going to need some direct instruction. We're going to talk a little bit more about that too when you think about students who may have some particular special needs. Then the last one is this notion of action generating. In other words, not just learning for learning's sake, but learning to be an active citizen, learning to be able to engage with their community, to propose solutions, to think innovatively and creatively, and to see if they can generate some ideas for some of the challenges that we experience in our environment, in our world, and then, of course, within their local community. And so some of the Project Wild extensions activities do, in fact, get the kids thinking the so what. Okay, so we've explored this, we've had this experience, but then what meaning can we take from it, and how do we want to give back to our community, or maybe engage in some action that can improve or change our community. So the good news is there's a lot of pedagogy options for your Project Wild lessons, as you obviously well know, and these reflect best practices in being inclusive for students for a variety of reasons. So that's all really good news. That said, Project Wild is a curriculum. The lessons were designed, and they are designed in a general form. They may be giving some extension ideas or some alternatives, you know, depending upon whether or not you feel like you can go out into the field or you have to do something inside a building, whether or not you have access to certain materials and what the variations are. So the lessons are created in a great way, in a general way, but there are some things that we can do to try and enhance those lessons in order to bring in more students with different needs. So let's go to the next slide. And by the way, if anybody has any comment or anything, I wish that they would make it. Like, jump in, say whatever you want to say, whenever you want to say it, and we'll address those questions too. Is that right, Mark?
Yes, that's right. And if you can let us know in the chat box, you can type your question, or if you want to talk, we can unmute you as well. So I also wanted to give a quick update on how people ranked their level of knowledge, and thank you, Kelly, for tallying these up. Nobody gave themselves a 1 or a 5, so no one identified themselves as an expert or a complete novice. But we did have one person give themselves a 2, 7 people a 3, 1 person a 3.5, and 4 people ranked themselves at a 4. So that gives a pretty good idea that people consider themselves, I would say, moderate and maybe slightly above an average level of knowledge for this kind of content.
Well, that's good. And so let's take it from the idea that I'm going to be sharing information that I've put together. This is not my information. I have gathered this information from a variety of resources, but you also have expertise. And so I really want this to be a sharing. And I hope that those of you who have worked more closely with all of these lessons can jump in and give us some specific ideas for the things that you do. So let's make sure that you write in or chat. Okay. So one of the ideas behind universal design is the idea that we want to have access to free and appropriate education. This obviously comes from the legislation that was passed first in 1975 for Individuals with Disabilities Act. And it's the idea that students who have some kind of disability and who qualify for special education can have a free and appropriate education. It's also the notion of, in terms of even Brown versus Board of Education, the idea that separate is not equal, and that what we're looking for is we're really looking for everybody to be involved. And you look on the left-hand side of the screen, and that's a pretty popular graphic. So I'm glad, I see somebody says that you like it, and I'm glad that you do like that. That's a pretty popular graphic to try and illustrate what we're going to be talking about today. And so let's just kind of pick apart that graphic. If you look on the far left side, there's a fence and everybody's got the same instruction. In other words, we're giving the same lesson, the same box. Everybody stands on that lesson. And you can see that not everybody then has access to the game. So we don't have equity. We don't have everybody's needs being met. Well, the second graph is what's pretty common. That's what we do. We say, okay, Well, one child doesn't need any kind of assistance, and so he can just stand there. The middle child only needs one box or one accommodation, and then the next child needs two accommodations in order for all of them to see the game. And that is a really common way of trying to get to this notion of equal access or equitable access. One of the other options, of course, would be to design the lesson from the get-go, where the lesson is designed with all of those needs in mind, and it's designed in a way where everybody has access without having to rethink the lesson. Because Project Wild is a curriculum that's established, and we're going to go back and analyze those lessons, we're really kind of working in the middle section. We're trying to figure out what we can do to change the boxes or to change the levels of accommodations that kids might need. But as you begin to design additional lessons and as you think about your own lessons, one of the things you want to do is to think about how you can do that universal design from the beginning. All right, so that's a big idea with this presentation, is how can we either design or how can we change the lesson design in order to make sure that more students are benefiting from the Project Wild lessons. The handout on the right-hand side is what Universal Design by the CASP organization has done for learning. And you'll notice that it breaks it down into three primary categories. How are students engaged? How can we make sure that students have a way of being engaged in multiple ways? How is information being represented? How are students getting that information, and how are they accessing that information in different ways? And then the third one is what kind of action? How are they able to show you what they are learning or what they understand or what they can do? And so we're going to look at a particular lesson, and we're going to break each one of those down, and I'm going to ask you to analyze the lesson. I'm hoping some of you were able to look at the lessons in advance so that we can have a conversation about what you discovered with regard to those three things. And so I've created a handout where we're going to break down universal design into the itty bitty bits. So you'll notice on that left handout it says engagement. And then under engagement, there are three categories. It talks about provide options for self-regulation, provide options for sustaining effort and persistence, and then provide options. You see those three categories. Well, there's three categories for each of the three categories. Let's go to the handout mark where we're going to look at the lesson on tracks. And it's on page 36 to 41 of the new book. So if we could do that, that would be great. Mark's going to pull that handout up.
Okay, and before I do, I wanted to flag that we're dealing with some new content. So if you haven't seen the new 2018 version of Tracks, there's a new component to it, and so a new part A, and that is students are learning about gait patterns, and you can see the student page on the right side of your screen here. So new content, and I just want us all to be on the same page here.
Yeah, and before you get off this page, I think that this is a really good thing, and I was going to bring this page up. You know how you have the student activities kind of packet to where you can have, I don't know where I saw it, but I have a copy of where all of the student handouts are in one packet. And I think it's on page 11 in that packet, and then it looks like it's on page 41 in the actual book. Anyway.
I think the packet you may be referring to, it might be something specific for Project Wild folks in Texas.
Oh, sorry.
Sure. But that's okay. A lot of other states may have similar packets. And we also have all of these student pages available for download online at the Project Wild website, which is now part of the Fish and Wildlife, or the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies website at fishwildlife.org.
Terrific. Okay, so, oh, thank you, Kelly. So let's look at, when we go through the handout that he's going to pull up in just a minute, we're going to look at several, there you go. We're going to look at each one of these things in relationship to that lesson on tracks. And I didn't actually, I put these in reverse order. Sorry about that. So it may not line up with that handout that was the slide before, but all the information is here. And so I'd like to go through each one of these, and there's quite a bit that we can talk about. So the first one says, does the lesson use multiple means of representation? In other words, can the students perceive that information in a variety of ways? Can they see it? Can they hear it? Can they touch it? Can they, I don't think you would do this often, but could they taste it maybe? I don't know. So the idea is that we want to be sure that they have multiple forms of representation. So when you look at the TRACS lesson, can you share with us what you see about multiple means of representation in that particular lesson? And I've already got a list, so if anybody can't look at it, but I'd like to see if the audience can respond. So the question is, does the TRACS lesson provide multiple means or multiple options for students to perceive the information? Okay, I'm going to give you my ideas and then you can respond. You ready? So in that particular TRACS lesson, one of the things that you do is you show them photos of tracks. You give them plastic casts of casts of tracks. You give them plastic replicas and hand-drawn. So one of the things that you notice in the TRACS lesson, there are multiple means by which students can perceive what a track is, how it's shaped, and that different animals produce different shapes or different images of tracks. And so that's a good thing. The other thing that that lesson does is it also provides a video. It says that in case students can't touch or see them in pictures and so forth, but that you could also show the animals in action making those tracks. And so videos are another form or access for them to visually see what those tracks are. And that's good news. I'm going to come back to that handout that Mark just showed you. And I want you to think about the design of that handout. So that's a very visual representation. I don't know, Mark, if you can go back to that handout on that prior screen. So let's look at that handout. It's a real visual piece of work, right? It's lots of text. The good news about it is it's graphically broken up. In other words, it's a table and it has headings and it breaks the information down. So that helps students read it. But what else do you notice about it? It's complicated. And so one of the things that you want to consider is a single handout for some children who might have learning disabilities or attention problems or who are second language learners. This is a real complex handout. And we need to think about how we might either prepare students for this handout in advance, such as you look at the 3 levels of tracks, the planet grade, digigrade, and I'm going to not say the right one. Anybody want to tell me, Mark, you want to tell me how to say that third one, ungulate grade? You want to think about how those are complex ideas and that for a lot of kids, you're going to need to break those down. So I'd like you to think about kids with dyslexia and how this this handout needs to be much more simplified. Another way you could do to simplify it is you see the animal examples. You could maybe add some photos there, not just pictures of the line drawings of their actual leg bone structures, but then the actual animal itself. That would reduce some of the reading, especially for second language learners. So you need to think about the handout and who's in the class that's going to be going through the Project Wild session. Pictures of each animal in motion might be, yes, I agree, Kristen. I think that's a great idea. That would also be very helpful. You also might want to break this handout into parts. So rather than having it all on one page, you might want to break it out into what the animal looks like, reconfigure it, what the animal looks like, then what are the tracks and the path that the tracks make in a different way. I think it's also somewhat visually confusing when you look at how the tracks are underneath each of those three sections. And so I just think that we need to really think about the structure of that kind of handout. All right, let's go back to the handout, the worksheet that you're working on.
And
okay.
If I may jump in, Sherry, say that as educators, as you all find ways to modify and adjust what is printed or what is graphically represented in the Project Wild Guide, of course, we would love it if you could share it, and we can help make those things available through the Project Wild website.
That would be great. And in fact, that's a really great idea of just having a space where, and maybe you already do, and I haven't seen it, but having a space to where people can upload differentiation ideas, right? Accommodations and inclusive ideas that they're using that are being effective. That would be a really fantastic way of sharing resources. I need to move along. So let's look at another one just as an example. Great. So let's go to this one. And by the way, I have notes on all of these columns, so I don't know how detailed you want to get, but let's keep going. So it says, let's look at the one in the middle. It says, does this lesson use multiple means of expression? Provide options for expressive skills and fluency. Are there existing options in the media or for communication, in the tools for composition and problem solving, and in the scaffolding needed for practice? And one of the things that I think is a challenge for this particular one, well, first of all, let's talk about the good news. There's talking. Students can point to information, they can write, they get to draw what they see in terms of animal tracks, they get to sort, that's great. I'm looking at some of the ideas. They get to have group conversation and talk about it. Yes, there's lots of different means of expression. One of the challenges that you might run into are making the molds, and whether or not a student might have some kind of physical disability, or whether or not students can engage with plaster of Paris or whatever else that they might need in order to make those molds through allergens or whatever. And so thinking about how you can get students who have those physical limitations engaged in making those the molds is going to probably take some planning as well. And then one other idea, and I don't remember where it was, but let's say that you are going out into the field and the students are going to be identifying those tracks. Well, a lot of tracks might happen at the edge of the water or down an embankment or under rocks or something that are down on the ground. If you have students who are not able to get to those places physically, there might be something that you could do to where you take your molds of tracks and you put them on a stick of some kind, to where students could then make their own tracks using those molds with using that extension stick, so they could see how they are how they're being made by the animals in the actual environment. That may not be a great idea, but it's one idea. And so I just want you to think about how you can bring the tracks to the student if the student can't get to the tracks. The other thing that is a challenge in this is when you're going out into the field, being able to identify the field trip spots that are more accessible. And one of the things that Texas has is on their Texas Wildlife website, they have a list of wheelchair accessible parks and places to where there is more accessibility. And so that might be a resource that you folks in Texas could use. And I'm assuming all states have that kind of thing. And so really thinking about how can you make sure that A, if you're going to go on a field trip, everybody goes on the field trip. And B, if you're going to go on the field trip, but the actual area is not conducive to everybody walking in and out of the space, then how can you bring that space closer to the students? And so thinking about that. One of the ways would be through photographs. You could do that. It would also be as to take the molds with you rather than making the molds after the project, would be to take molds prepared in advance so that the students could see them there. Do you have any other ideas about, first of all, we're talking about expression, but then also that notion of engagement in the field experience? I'm just seeing if anybody's going to jump in. Okay, let's look at another one. And I'm kind of jumping around, but I want this more as a resource for you. And I just want to be able to highlight some things that you can think about. Let's look at the next one. It says the next one says, does the lesson provide multiple means of engagement? Well, we've already identified several of those. There's one question. Look at question 8 if you have a chance to do that. And it says carefully remove the mold. Oh, wait, that's not the one I want. Hang on. Well, maybe it is. I said something about it could be differentiated in terms of different questions. In other words, one of the ways that you can differentiate instruction is by how you ask students to engage with that information. So second language learners, students who need processing time for language differences, giving them some more direct questions where they can answer with what is obviously seen versus something that is inferred. So asking more identification, can you describe it? Can you tell me what you see? Those are questions that students who are second language learners can tap into from their own natural language and from their own experience. And then you can work up to ideas of what can you infer from that track about what it says about that animal or what it says about that habitat. So I want you to think about differentiation in terms of how to engage students with a lesson, not just in the materials or the physical place that you go or the things that you show or how they write or draw, but it's also in the way in which you ask questions to get them engaged. Let's go to the next one. The next slide, sorry. Okay, we're there. So one of the things that I want to talk about is, does the lesson use multiple means of expression? And it's talking about this notion of provides for executive functioning. And so executive functioning, as we know, is this notion of kind of like your executive. It's the person in control of yourself, which is you, and how you're using your organizational skills, your self-awareness skills, and so forth, to really pay attention to what the lesson is about. And one of the things that I thought about for this particular lesson would be if you could have created a scientist checklist for the kinds of things that you're going to have them do when they go out there. So in other words, it helps them structure. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm reading a message. Sorry, I got to keep finishing my sentence. So it helps them structure the step-by-step things that they're supposed to be doing and what they might be paying attention to. And this might help children who have attention difficulties, who have executive functioning challenges. It could even help students who might have some behavioral challenges if they know that these are certain checklist things that they're wanting to do. And you could make it really cool by calling it a scientist checklist, and we know that scientists gather data and they make sure that they're following scientific procedure. So that would be something that I think might help with the executive functioning. On the next one, it says, does the lesson provide multiple means of engagement? And this is about self-regulation. So this is really about students who need to think about their bodies, about their voices, about their thinking, and about managing themselves in the context of whatever the learning environment is. And so, especially if you're going to be taking students out into the field, one of the things that you might want to do is to coach the students on how they're going to look, how to be sure that they protect nature and the animals and the habitat. Again, for some students who are like students who may be on the autism spectrum, You might want to be able to give them some visual cues about how they're going to behave and what they can touch and what they can't touch, and how to be careful and responsible and protect wildlife. So you want to think about how you can support that self-regulation visually and in practicing those skills, just the way you would do something like practicing social skills before any other kind of circumstance. And so the more you can do up front, the more that your trainers can do up front to help prepare their students, the more successful those students will be. Children with challenging behaviors are often the kids who get left behind because people are concerned about being out in a park or by a river or a stream or something like that, and children kind of walking off or doing something that would hurt themselves. And so it's really important on that self-regulation for students who need that scaffolding for you to provide them some kind of social skill preparation and checklist and visual supports once you get out and before you go out in the field, and then once you get out in the field. And by the way, that's also true if you're in the classroom as well. We've gone through just a few of these for this one, but you can see how this universal design for learning helps you think about the lesson in a variety of ways that really can help you tap into any of the students that are in the classroom that might need this kind of scaffolding. So does anybody want to add anything else to that one before we move on to the next one?
Sherry, I just have a question about the checklist. This is Kelly.
Hi, Kelly.
And, hello. So could you just give an example? What I'm envisioning is something like a checklist might include some things that we need to do or that the student needs to do before he or she goes outside, and it also might include things that pertain specifically to that activity. So
Yes, I was thinking in this one, in this category, I was thinking about what pertains to the activity. In other words, there's a lot of steps to the tracks, right? They're looking, they're recording, they can take a photograph, they can draw it, they're writing in the journal. There's lots of different tasks. And so in the executive functioning, I'm thinking it more of a scientist's checklist of activity, of things I need to do.
Got it.
I need to observe. I'm looking for 2 tracks. You know what I mean? And how I'm going to record in my journal, and I need to draw a picture. So in that column, I'm really thinking about that executive functioning and paying attention to the tasks. That's why I called it like a scientist's checklist.
Yes. Okay, got you. Thank you for that clarification.
Yes, but the third column, the one on self-regulation, those visual supports for behavior, or a social story, meaning a story that the student is situated in the story. I'm going on a field trip. I need to be sure to stay with my group. You know, that kind of thing. That might be more of something that they would read before they go out. You could even take the social story with you out. You could also have the behavioral expectations in pictures, like where not to walk. Walk on the path. Don't walk off the path. You know what I mean? Where you could have it in visual pictures, and then you can show the students that and remind them that if some kind of behavior irregularity begins to happen.
Got it. Thank you.
So I see them in both ways.
Yes.
Thank you.
And
Are we
Sherry,
ready?
I'm going to jump in. I'll let you know we have about 15 minutes left.
That's great. All right, then let's move on. All right, I'm sorry, I'm too long. Okay, let's go to the next one. The next one is Ann Tomlinson's model for differentiated instruction. And I use this model with my undergraduate students. And so it's got a lot of pieces to it, and I'm going to try to draw your attention to it, the major part of the pieces. So if you look on the left-hand side, it talks about 5 things that you need to consider, those general principles, and we're really not going to go over those. Those principles are good teaching principles, but what I do want to look at is the way that teachers can differentiate. And so it lists 4 things, and I want you to think about this. It talks about differentiating by content. Well, all right, there's different ways we can differentiate by content, and if you look down below, there it says by readiness, by interest, and learning profile. I'll talk about those in just a minute. The content says that you're going to change the materials in some way, you're going to change the information in some way, or that you're going to allow students to access different kinds of materials. The content is looking also at, is it complex content or is it more simple content? So it's about what they're learning. The next one is process. That's where you change how they learn. So you think about how students get the information, the process by which they take in the information. Are they going to watch a video? Are they going to read a handout? Are they going to talk to each other? So it's the process of taking in the information. And then the third one is product. That's how they're going to show you what they know, what they understand, and what they can do. So it's the kind of thing that they're going to produce in order for you to know that they do understand the concepts, such in the last lesson of that different animals walk in different ways, and based upon that, their footprints are going to be different. And then the fourth one is looking at the classroom, or in this case, the environment, wherever you are, whether it's inside a classroom or out, and kind of the tone and the inclusiveness and the acceptance and the ways in which different kids learn. So it's looking at that affect and that environment, that positive kind of relationship type of environment in the classroom. Okay, so there's those four things. The way that you change those four things is by considering students' readiness. Well, what's readiness? Well, I'm 62. And in my day, if we were going to say that we were going to group students by content, what we meant was we were going to do ability grouping. And the low group was going to go with the low reading group, and the high group was going to go with the high reading group. That is not what Ann Tomlinson is referring to. What she says is that every single unit of instruction, students have different readiness. I might know a lot about animal tracking, but I might not know very much about habitats. That's a poor example, but you get the idea. And so what Ann Tomlinson says is, she says that we need to understand about students' readiness, and that it's not fixed, that it is a growth mindset, that students' readiness in one lesson might be different than their readiness in another lesson. And so she's saying that one way that you can group students would be by readiness. So for example, if I'm going to go out and I'm going to be looking at tracks, and I had that handout that was really complicated, that might work for kids who are really high proficient readers. But for kids who are not so high in their reading, they might need the same content, but they might need it in more simple terms instead of having so much text. They might need the same text in a way, the same ideas, but it broken down in different ways. So readiness is one way. Now, Project Wild does great on the other two. So when it talks about interest and learning profiles, interest is where the students get to choose their passions, right? They get to say, I really am curious about this and I want to know about this. So Project Wild has all kinds of variations, both in content and in process and in what kids are going to produce by interest. So kids can learn different things, they can learn those things in different ways, and then they can show what they learn with different kinds of products. And that's really exciting. Project Wild does that beautifully. And then learning profile is also considered, and that is kind of the way that you take in information or the way that you show things. So do I want to hear things? Do I want to see things? Do I want to talk to my friends about this before I write? Do I want to write? Do I want to make a movie? Do I want to do an actual 3D model? So again, learning profiles are also something that Project Wild does really well. The hard one is the readiness. So here's what I want us to do. I want us to go to the handout. We're going to skip interest and learning profile because that's the toughest one. What I want you to consider is the visual that's on the right-hand side of this page called the Equalizer. And in the materials that were sent to you, you have a handout from ASCD that explains all of these ideas around the Equalizer. We don't have time to go through each and every one of these, but what you can see is that it thinks about content in different ways, and it thinks about how you can vary the content kind of like on your speakers, you can vary like when you're listening to music, you can vary the content to where in the first one, are you providing students with more foundational information or transformational information? Well, some students, they may not be exposed to the idea that you're going to be teaching, so you may need to give them more background information. But other students, they might really know a lot about the lesson, and they really need to be pushed and provided with some transformational ideas. And so the equalizer is this idea about how to address different levels of readiness so that students are given what Tomlinson calls, and this is a really important idea, respectful tasks. That you don't just, quote unquote, water down, make it so simple that it has less meaning. In other words, you don't change the objectives for the lesson. You keep those objectives the same for everybody. But what you're trying to do is to present that material in ways that are more accessible for kids who have different levels of readiness. So let's go to the next slide. This one breaks down the area of interest. You can go through any of these lessons and you can ask yourself these questions about interest. We're not going to do that one today, but it's here for you so that when you look at it later, you can go through that process. Go to the next one. That one's on preferred learning modalities. Again, Project Wild is really great. They give you lots of ways by which kids can look at content, take in information, and show what they know, understand, and do. So preferred learning modalities is pretty well included in Project Wild. Let's go to the next one. This one's where we're challenged. So let's go to the lesson on page 70 in the new book, and it's called My Kingdom for a Shelter. And what I want you to do is I want you to think about how a student's readiness might engage or might need to change how that lesson is taught. And here's one of the other questions I want you to think about, just as a side note, and I really do want you to answer. How would you determine what a student's readiness is? How do you think that would happen? How would a teacher determine that? So the lesson is on Make a Kingdom for a Shelter. You want to show them that new material, Mark? I think it's on the next page.
Yes. So, so the new version of My Kingdom for a Shelter has new procedures at the beginning that were pulled from the activity that was known as Beautiful Basics, as well as some components of Everyone Needs a House. Those two other Project Wild activities have been combined with My Kingdom for a Shelter. And part of that is having this procedure in which students compare the essential needs of people, pets, and wildlife. So that is the main part of the new content.
Your question, Jerry, is a fantastic question. That is a great, great question. And your question, it shows you're going to go advance to the head of the class, because your question about students who are homeless or at risk of homelessness, that really relates to the third model of culturally responsive teaching. And I think that that's going to be one of the issues, that notion of being aware of the students' own lives and how that's fitting into the lessons. I think that that's really a great question. And I think that we can talk about that. So, yeah. So, yes. So this particular handout that Mark just put up would be a great way of tapping into a student's readiness if you were to do it as kind of a pre-assessment in some way. And they wouldn't have to fill out the whole chart, but you could actually get students to say those three things, or identify some needs for people, pets. Sorry, my video is covering up the other one. Oh, wildlife. And so you could get them to do that as a pre-assessment, and that might be a tool by which you could determine the student's readiness. And what we're really talking about is the student's background and prior knowledge and experience of the concepts taught in My Kingdom for a Shelter. So what I want you to do is I want you to go to the next slide, Mark, and I want you to think about this lesson. I'm hoping that you got to look at it. And I want you to look at the handout to the box to the left, and it says it's not fixed. Readiness is not fixed, and that's a really key idea. We're not talking about tracking. We're talking about the fact that for every different unit and different concept, the student's readiness may be different. And that it's a growth mindset, and that what we can do is we can drop the student into the lesson in different points with different materials, with different scaffolding, so that they can achieve the same, and that's really important, the same objectives that any other student in that lesson is going to present. So I've asked some questions here, and I've shown you how that handout that I mentioned, the Equalizer, breaks down the content and the materials in different ways. So it says, okay, let's look at the first one. Is it foundational or transformation? Is the material too difficult or complex? Or does the student need to be stretched? Do they need to go in a transformational way? So one of the things that I thought about is that in order to be transformational, one of the things that the project does is what would happen to this animal if somehow their habitat was changed. For example, what would happen to the animals' homes when humans move into that particular habitat? And so being able to think transformational rather than just looking at what a habitat is and what maybe specific animals need within their own specific habitat and building a habitat, it would be to take it even further and to say, okay, what happens to that animal's home or shelter and the habitat if some other species, i.e. humans, move into that particular space? How would that change? For example, we know that birds or other animals might use items that we have left as trash. And so then how does that factor into what they're being exposed to into using those items into their shelters, right? So there's different ways that you can transform. Let's do another one. Look at the second one where it says concrete to abstract. So in this lesson on My Kingdom for a Shelter, the item number 3 assumes that these kids have seen different kinds of shelters. And so one of the things that you have to think about is for some students, you're going to need to have real concrete representation. You're going to need to show them maybe 3D models, or maybe you've created an example of a shelter in advance. This is also, this is particularly true for kids who are second language learners. Having real objects, actual objects, in order for them to develop that language is going to be really important. So for some kids, you're going to need to have that concrete example before you go into that lesson so that when they go into the lesson, they can pay attention to the major ideas. You can go through and see that there's a lot. Simple to complex. The idea of a journal. Maybe for some students, you need to have prompts for them to write in their journal. Like you need to give them prompts to glue into their journal, or you need to give them specific questions. Whereas other students, you might be able to get them to record their notes freely and to make their observations without much structure. For some students, they might need to glue in photos of ideas, but for other kids, they might be able to sketch those ideas. So you're just thinking about how the students can access those resources and whether or not they need something that's more simple with fewer details, or it can be really complex and they can do things at a higher level. All right, let's go to the next one. I'm about down to 3 minutes, I bet. So you can see how all of these, and I don't have time to really talk about each one, but I've tried to show you how you can think and ask yourself about each one of these lessons, and you won't be changing every single one of these components. I mean, like, there's a lot here for you to consider, and you won't necessarily change every single component. It won't necessarily mean that you're going to need to go more structured, more open, or clearly define fuzzy problems. It doesn't mean they're going to do all of them, but you certainly should consider them and then decide based upon your student population which ones of these things that you might need to change. All right, let's go to, well, do you have any comments or any thoughts? Do you see why I say readiness is more complicated? It really takes knowing your students well. It takes time for you to consider what's in the lesson and how not just students with disabilities, but maybe you have, like I mentioned, we've already said second language learners, but it could be just any of your typical kids, and maybe for whatever reason, they have some need in this particular lesson for you to consider this. So this is not just about special education. And in fact, Tomlinson's work comes out of gifted education. And when you look in public schools, PK-12, Tomlinson's model is really used more just in general. It's not about this is a special education idea. So when we talk about doing this kind of differentiation by interest, by learning style, and by readiness in particular, it's really just thinking about your classroom and all the kids, not just some of the kids. Let's go to the next slide. So this is culturally responsive teaching, and I'm only going to be working with the slide on the left. Yes, Kiki, you're absolutely correct. The idea in order to do differentiated instruction, you're absolutely correct. You have to think about, you have to know that lesson really well. You have to understand the cognitive processes that are being expected of those students in that lesson. You have to think about the sequence of the lesson. You have to think about the way you're talking about the materials. You have to think about the way you're asking questions. So you're right. You have to really think about it in advance. And so you're right. Thanks a lot. I'll see you later, Julie. But anyway, I won't see you. Bye, Julie. But that's one of the things I want you to really embrace, is that you can't wait until you're out in the field to make these decisions. You have to be able to think about this in advance. You have to be able to really analyze your lesson plans in advance. And so as facilitators, what I'm asking you to do is to ask those teachers who then do the actual lessons in Project Wild to really think about who's in their classroom. Those teachers know their students. Facilitators might not, but the actual teachers do. And so then they can begin to think about how might they need to be changing. And remember that for a lot of students, those teachers are having to consult with their special education teachers, maybe a behavior specialist, and so forth, before they go out on a field trip or do some kind of lesson in that way. So there's lots of people who can help with the process. Let's finish up by doing culturally responsive teaching. I want you to look at the lesson on what you wear is what they were. So let's go to the next page. And the handout is not on the PowerPoint, but Mark has it to be able to show on the screen.
I'm pulling that up. Bear with me.
Well, I'm going to talk while you do that. So there are 4 components, and I'm using the model that was on the left. And so there are 4 components, and it talks about in what ways does or can the lesson include the student's native language. So in this lesson says what you wear is what they were. And it talks about the way in which we have used animal skins and plant products and those kinds of things and which kinds of clothing requires the life of an animal, and how our clothing choices impact species. And so that's a really important concept, right? And so one of the things that you can think about, though, is, are there cultural aspects to this lesson? So what populations might have it in their native traditions that animals are respected, but also a part of that clothing, and how that needs to be considered when we're trying to decide whether or not this is a good decision to use clothing made of animals, or a poor decision. And it's not to argue the fact that we have lots of options nowadays for clothing to where we don't have to risk the lives of animals, but it is a question about whether or not we are giving recognition to the traditions that have had culture built around that process. Also, this lesson talks about coats and making a coat. And so one of the cultural ideas that you could look at is, not everybody wears a coat. There are different kinds of outerwear that people use in order to protect themselves from elements. Also, where, geographically, where do people need to have something to protect themselves against cold elements versus we wouldn't be wearing coats where it's really, really hot or tropical. And so if we aren't wearing coats in that way, what kinds of clothing do we need to use in order to protect ourselves from whatever environment we live in? So I want to think about this lesson as opening it up a bit more, opening it up to a wider range of cultural considerations is what I'm hoping for. And you have it in your packet. I know Mark's struggling with getting it all on there, and it's because I have it in landscape. But these 4 questions, there you go. These 4 questions are a really good way of thinking about how the students' lives can fit within this lesson. The other thing that I think is interesting is, I don't know if it was in the last book or not, but it was looking at, no, it's here, it's for older students. It talks about, and on page 307, it talks about the idea of looking at different materials and labeling them and so forth. And one of the things that I know that when we start talking about our own clothing, that can get really complicated, because one of the participants talked about homeless kids. Well, also, if you have kids who, like my grandchildren, live with a lot of hand-me-downs, right? So they don't really know where their clothing comes from, or it is beyond looking at how it was made, like the label's not in it, you know, so we don't know what the products are for that particular clothing. And so finding ways that you can maybe protect or honor the circumstances of different students, to where we're looking at the different clothing and we're recognizing different clothing, but maybe we're not looking at our own clothing, that we're looking at samples of clothing, or we're looking online, or as it talks about catalogs, those kinds of things. And so just being aware of how students may be conscious and self-conscious of the clothes and where their clothes come from, or what they don't know about their clothes, and those decisions. The other complicating thing is, I don't know if you noticed, but in the handout, I put a picture from a company that does economically, environmentally friendly clothing, and it's out of Boulder, Colorado, and it was on the slide that opened up the culturally responsive teaching. And one of the things that you'll find is that a lot of clothing, there you go, this one was really reasonable, and I chose to put this description here because the price ranges, and of course who am I to say it's reasonable? It was reasonable to me, but my income is probably very different than someone else's. But a lot of the clothing that was indicated as economically friendly, I mean environmentally friendly, was not economically friendly. So there's also that tension between what is affordable and what is not. So I know that I'm almost out of time, and so I want to say just a couple of more things and then let you go. there's all kinds of things that you can think about. For example, on the tracks lesson, I personally don't leave footprints. I leave wheelchair tracks. So could you integrate that idea into your lesson or into the teacher's lesson? That might be something that would be intriguing, right? What other kinds of tracks might a human leave? And then there's another lesson that I didn't really get to, but it's the lesson on limiting factors, how many bears. And if you get a chance, look at that one, because it talks about the notion of what happens to blind and injured animals. And one of the things you want to think about is the human experience can be different than the animal in the four-legged creature animals. And so one of the things I was thinking about is when we talk about how an animal might be at risk when they have some kind of injury or quote-unquote disability, and how that affects their survival, and the sensitivity about that for students who are in the classroom, I think that that would be another thing that I would want to think about. And so I'm just trying to give you ideas for how to look at lessons carefully and to think about who's in the room. I think I'm out of time, Mark.
Okay, well, some of the references and resources that you provided are captured here on the slide, and so they will be accessible later. And I wanted to give a few quick announcements before we sign off, and that is keep in mind that we are just about to kick off our I Wonder Wild campaign, where you can encourage educators and their students to send in questions about North American wildlife, and we will find, if the question is selected, we will find a wildlife expert in one of the agencies to answer it. Also, if you are at either of these upcoming meetings, NAAE in Spokane in October, or at the NSTA regional meeting in the DC area, please come see us. We'll be doing some presentations in those meetings as well. So at that, I want to say thank you. Thank you very much for helping us out, Sherry, and your presentation. It's very helpful. We will make this recording available. There was also a request to have the PowerPoint available, and Sherry, you and I can talk about that later if we can make that happen or not, but we'll share whatever we can.
Can I also say that I would love to hear from people who chose to attend if they have additional ideas, which I know you do, because I can learn from you folks as well. So I would really love to hear from people, and you have my email address.
All right. Well, at that, we'll go ahead and sign off. So thank you all for attending, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.